It's inanimate carbon god time once again, and I want to begin this episode by saying that something kind of remarkable happened recently. I read a book. This would not normally be news for most people, usually not for me anyway, but I haven't read anything in months. I've got literally thousands of books to read, and I have accepted that I will simply never live long enough to read all of them, so it's not like I'm struggling to find stuff to read, I'm just struggling to find the will to read it. Something similar to my stupidly large backlog of films and TV that I haven't watched, but I'm more annoyed somehow by the books, because there's even more of them. And until a couple of weeks ago, I hadn't finished anything since the previous November, and I'm not entirely sure why. But for the purposes of this podcast, I'm blaming Madame Bovary. I did not like Madame Bovary at all when I first read it, I don't know how many years ago. Greatest novel of all time, apparently, at least according to lots of people who aren't me. But, being me, I have suspected for a long time I should probably give it another go, because I've found quite a few times that I just haven't got some books until I've read them a second time when I was a few years older. The question was, though, which version to go for? Because Gustave Flaubert is a writer who apparently poses particular problems in translating his work to English, especially with Madame Bovary because of the very particular way he wrote French. And I don't read French well enough that I can just read it in the original. I'm kind of stuck with translations. So I did a bit of research, and most of the acclaim for recent versions seems to go to the new Penguin edition by Lydia Davis. But then I read an article in which Davis admitted to not actually liking the book that much, which put me off wanting to read her version, so I finally settled on the Adam Thorpe translation. Thorpe's selling point was that his version only used English words that were current in 1856 when the book was originally published, to avoid anachronisms, modern slang, and so forth. And this seemed like an eminently good idea, so I went with this one. And I got about a third of the way through before I realised I was actually hating the book in a way that I hadn't done the first time round, that first time having been the old Penguin Classics translation by Alan Russell, which I didn't like, but I didn't hate it like I did this version. At the same time, I don't know that Adam Thorpe is necessarily the one at fault here, because Flaubert's original French version might well be one of the greatest books ever, but I have my doubts because, frankly, I haven't liked anything else I've read by him, except for The Temptation of St. Anthony, which is uncharacteristic in many ways. All of his other works that I've read have been translated by various other people, and I haven't liked any of them, so maybe it's just Flaubert that can bugger off. At any rate, I don't think I'll be trying the Lydia Davis version for comparison purposes at any point. Anyway, having eventually realised I was never going to finish The Adventures of Emma Bovary, I put it aside, and I kind of put aside my desire to read as well. I wound up in hospital for an overnight stay a week or so after that, and while I was waiting to get, operated upon, I started reading Barry Obama's memoir, which I was liking, but I wasn't in the reading mood, so I didn't finish it either, though I do intend to finish that at some point. So I didn't read anything from the end of November to nearly the end of February, and I finally broke the drought with this. The Magnetic Fields by André Breton and Philippe Soupeau, a new translation by Charlotte Mandel. Picked this for two reasons. One, it's extremely short, and two, it's also the point where surrealism officially started, officially in inverted commas. Surrealism emerged in the mid-1920s in large part out of the Dada movement of the second half of the previous decade. Dada had been a reaction against the carnage and upheaval of the First World War, and it kind of absorbed ideas from the other avant-garde movements of the era to set itself up as this anti-art, anti-aesthetic, anti-reason and logic thing. It was basically an international tendency that first came together according to most histories, in Zurich in 1916, but as time passed and the war finally ended, the movement started to descend upon Paris and it settled there around 1920 and basically kind of burnt out by about 1923, whereupon several of the participants carried on into surrealism. This was the milieu from which André Breton emerged. It's probably fair to say that Breton had some sort of control freak aspect to him. He had some kind of desperate need to be in charge of something. And he had some sort of personal beef with Tristan Tzara, who was one of the founders of Dada and was kind of its unofficial head figure. And when Tzara attempted to stage a play of his in 1923, Breton provoked a riot in the theatre that basically ended the Parisian Dada movement. And the survivors then started adopting a new description, which was surrealism. Now, that word had actually been coined in 1917 by poet, playwright, and pornographer Guillaume Apollinaire to describe his play The Breasts of Tiresias and a ballet called Parade by Eric Satie and Jean Cocteau, when both of them were staged that year. Unfortunately, Apollinaire then died in the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, so he was unable to have any part in the battle to control the new surrealist movement. And it was a literal battle at times between two main groups headed by Yvan Goll and André Breton, involving actual physical punch-ups as well as printed screeds. Eventually, Breton declared himself the winner, and thereafter surrealism as a movement was basically his baby. He decided who and what was or wasn't surrealist, based largely on who he was feuding with at any given point. One of the casualties of Breton's determination to be the one true leader of surrealism was, ironically, the co-author of this book we were supposed to be talking about. Philippe Soupault had been introduced to Breton by Guillaume Apollinaire, and in 1919 the two collaborated upon the magnetic fields as an experiment in automatic writing. The idea was they would write together for 7 days, and whatever they had at the end of that time was the book, with no editing or touching up after it was finished. I have several doubts about how well they actually adhered to this plan, particularly that last point. I wouldn't call the book contrived as such, but for all of Breton's talk about surrealism being pure psychic automatism, it does look at least a bit planned out. One section is a dialogue between what I suppose you'd call two characters, and dialogue just doesn't strike me as the sort of thing you quote-unquote automatically produce. I don't know, I obviously wasn't there when they were doing it. I'll just say that I've experimented with automatic writing myself in the past, and my things came out different to theirs in ways that may or may not mean anything. As for the book itself, it's probably best summed up as a sort of prose poetry text. I said I turned to it because it's so short, but I don't think I was ready for how dense it also is. The language is really rich, and the images it conjures up are too, but it really doesn't behave like a so-called normal book, which I didn't expect it to, because obviously that kind of goes without saying with this sort of thing. There's no narrative, no characters apart from that little dialogue section that I mentioned, and I don't know if characters is even an appropriate word at that point. So I was expecting something, but it was still kind of harder than I expected it would be. I don't know if I actually liked the magnetic fields or not, and again I suppose that's maybe something that goes with the territory. It's just so hard to appraise on multiple levels, and part of that might be because this sort of thing has been parodied so much, because surrealism does lend itself to parody, and this sort of collision of incongruous ideas like a physical space being inhabited by smells has been the root of a lot of humour through the 20th century. So actually encountering it in its sincere form, for want of a better word, was a bit jarring. It's not meant to be amusing, I'm sure, but somehow it's tempting to read it that way. It's really hard to describe, which is kind of why I went on more about the historical background of the book than the book itself. The book is obviously historically important as the official birth work of surrealism, and we know that it was that because After all, Breton told us it was, even though it was written in 1919 and published in 1920, while Dada was still flourishing and long before surrealism was officially a thing. Because, after all, Breton was the Pope of surrealism, as he was called by some of the enemies he made over the years, including Georges Bataille. He had to be able to control it, and so he had to be able to claim to have created the first surrealist work. Alas that Guillaume Apollinaire was long dead and couldn't argue the point with him, but I suspect that if he had, Breton would have probably just kicked him out of the movement. One last thing about André Breton, his definition of surrealism was rooted in what he called pure psychic automatism, as I mentioned, and for that reason he thought surrealist visual art would never work, because he didn't think that principle of automatism could actually translate visually. And of course, if people think of surrealism now, it's probably usually in terms of visual art, film and painting and so forth. Maybe Breton just didn't know as much about surrealism as he thought he did. So at least I've finally read something for the first time in ages. My vague plan to read one book a week this year has obviously not panned out. Maybe I can make up for lost time over the next few months, and maybe this channel will actually function more like the booktube channel that I originally envisaged it being. Stranger things have happened, or so I'm told. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Inanimate Carbon God. Until next time, bye for now.